Harlan West sat alone in the corner of the Scranton Marie Callender's, a man hidden in plain sight. Before him rested a slice of apple pie, the dessert that carried his family's name through decades of kitchens and countless tables. At first glance it seemed faithful, a golden crust, a gloss of cinnamon glaze. Yet when the fork pressed down, the illusion collapsed. The shell cracked clean, but the filling bled out in a thin, sticky rush more like canned glue than fruit. The scent was nearly right, almost convincing, until the bite revealed the lie, sharp chemical sweetness, the metallic tang of something manufactured. He forced himself to swallow each chew a verdict. Then, without raising his voice, he set the fork aside and whispered the sentence that marked the beginning of war. "This is not our pie." A betrayal wrapped in pastry, waiting to be unmasked. Harlan West was 47, the quiet figurehead of Marie Callender's, though no one in the Scranton restaurant suspected it. He had stripped himself of boardrooms and titles, dressed instead in faded jeans, a button-down, dulled by years of wear, and a cap pulled low enough to erase recognition. To the passing eye, he was just another customer, the kind who might stop in for a meal before heading home. That was the point. He wanted no special attention, no filtered reports polished by managers. He wanted to see, to smell, to taste the truth for himself. The chain bore his family's legacy, its recipes meant to embody honesty, yet his instincts told him the story on paper was lying. He had walked through countless kitchens and countless dining rooms, but this time in this store, his heartbeat carried the edge of suspicion. Invisible in plain sight, he was both judge and witness. His mind strayed backward as he sat in that corner to a kitchen small enough that every sound was memory. The soft scrape of a knife slicing apples into thin, neat arcs. The breath of cinnamon lifting through air warmed by an old oven's sigh. And above it all, his mother's voice steady as truth itself. A real pie stands tall. A dishonest one collapses under its lies. He had lived with that sentence, carried it into adulthood, carried it into boardrooms where decisions were measured against that simple rule. Pie was never just dessert, it was a covenant. You honored it or you betrayed it. The crust before him told him which had happened here. That same warmth of childhood now stood beside the cold certainty of deceit, and the two clashed inside his chest. The lesson that shaped his life was alive again, but now as accusation, not comfort. He lifted his gaze and let it wander across the restaurant that bore his family's promise. What he saw stripped him further of patience. The windows were smeared with the oily imprint of careless hands. The counter wore a dull film of neglect, caramel streaks that should have been wiped hours before. Behind the glass case, fingerprints marred the panes, framing pies that looked tired, not inviting. A flickering screen recycled last season's promotion stale in both message and glow. At the register, a young clerk leaned on one elbow, scrolling through a phone without glancing at the line of customers. Not one greeting, not one echo of the phrase every employee was trained to deliver. Welcome to Marie Callender's. It was absence he felt more than presence, an absence of care, of pride of soul. And with each detailed disappointment hardened brick by brick into the certainty that something far darker lay behind it. At the register, Harlan studied the rhythm of indifference. The young cashier barely raised his eyes as he slid coins and bills across the counter, the gesture curt, almost dismissive. No acknowledgement, no trace of warmth, not even the faintest attempt at courtesy. Customers shuffled through like shadows, each transaction stripped of human weight. Some left without a word, some without a glance, and still the boy kept scrolling the glowing screen hidden in his palm. The room carried a silence heavy, not from peace but from vacancy, as if the store itself had been hollowed. Hospitality was gone, the welcome erased. Marie Callender's had built its reputation on the comfort of home, but here in this corner of Scranton, the promise was abandoned. Harlan registered each fracture, each lapse, each omission. He knew such carelessness was never isolated. What rotted at the surface almost always hid a deeper wound below. When his number was called 42, Harlan rose with the others, collected his tray, and returned to the booth. The slice gleamed beneath the light lattice crust, neatly browned glaze shining like amber. To anyone else it was flawless, an echo of tradition plated for a stranger. He set the fork and pressed down, and the illusion failed instantly. The crust parted too easily, collapsing without resistance. From within, the filling slumped outward, syrup thick and shapeless, a gluey mass posing as fruit. He lifted a forkful, tasted, and the verdict struck. Sweetness without depth, sharp with chemical residue, and aftertaste metallic foreign. This was not imperfection. It was betrayal. His mouth worked against the bite, forcing it down, but his mind was already elsewhere, aligning memory with proof. The pie that should have carried generations had been replaced by an imitation, a counterfeit dressed in sugar. Something sacred had been quietly dismantled. He set the fork aside, then noticed what should have been hidden. Beneath the plate, half tucked under the napkin, lay a small printed slip. He pulled it free, turned it in his hand. The words read, "Sunrise Imports." The name meant nothing, and that was the problem. No record of it in approved suppliers, no place in the long network of trusted farms and vendors. A stranger in a house that allowed no strangers. He slid the slip into his pocket, his gaze sharpening face carved into stone. This was no accident, no careless substitution. This was a choice planned, deliberate, calculated. Behind every quiet fraud stood a hand guiding it, a will shaping it. And Harlan knew instinctively this one reached beyond Scranton, beyond a single pie. The trail had begun thin as paper, small as a slip, but heavy with the weight of something waiting to be uncovered. Harlan pulled his phone from his pocket and typed a message to Drake Ellison, the man he trusted most in operations. "Sunrise Imports. Check it now." The reply came back almost instantly. "Not on the list." A pause, then another message company registered last year. "No track record in food service. No distribution licenses we recognize." Harlan stared at the words until they blurred, until suspicion sharpened into certainty. New companies appeared every year, but never inside their supply chain without approval, and never tied to the one item that defined Marie Callender's itself. This wasn't just a gap in oversight, it was a wound red and raw glaring against the pages of clean reports. Sunrise was a ghost, with a name a hole carved deliberately into the system. If someone had forced it into their operations, it meant deceit wasn't incidental. It was engineered, and it had just been found. He set the phone down and let his eyes roam across the dining room. What he saw matched the taste that still lingered on his tongue. Staff drifted through tasks like bodies without anchors. A girl with a rag wiped at the counter in distracted circles, her other hand clutching a phone, thumbs alive with messages more urgent than the guests before her. Customers sat in their booths with the stillness of habit, chewing quietly, swallowing without notice, eyes fixed elsewhere. No laughter, no warmth, no thread connecting room to soul. The atmosphere pressed inward, heavy like the aftermath of a funeral where words have run dry and all that remains is silence. This was not the store he had built, not the experience meant to cradle strangers like family. This was neglect, suffocating and deliberate, and it stank of something hiding just beyond sight. He felt it. The absence screamed louder than words. His gaze drifted to the back where a frosted glass door stood with black letters across its center office. Authorized personnel only. Behind the blur of the glass movement stirred a silhouette shifting just enough to betray presence. Reports had flagged this location for months, margins too clean expenses, too thin numbers polished until they gleamed, and now here was the center of it, the unseen figure who ran the floor with such hollow efficiency. Meredith Klain. 10 years in the system, a reputation once steady now cracked by silence and suspicious profit. Harlan felt the edges of the puzzle beginning to align. The false pie, the slip of sunrise, the hollow staff, all threads weaving toward the figure behind that door. His pulse steadied not with calm, but with the knowledge that he was close. The shadow he watched was not just a manager. It was the adversary he had come to unmask. The phone buzzed again. Drake's message lit the screen, Sunrise Imports registered to Silas Klain. Harlan froze mid-breath. The name struck with surgical precision, a surname already etched into his suspicions. Klain. Meredith Klain. The shadow behind the office door suddenly sharpened into focus. This was not a lone mistake, not a desperate shortcut by a struggling store. This was bloodline. Brother and sister tied not only by family but by fraud. The implications multiplied with quiet violence. A manager could falter, a franchise could cut corners, but when kin built a shell company together, the rot reached deeper. Numbers massaged into safety. Ingredients slipped through back doors. And the family name protecting it all. Harlan's pulse hammered once, then steadied. The puzzle was no longer scattered. Each piece clicked against the next with dreadful clarity. The betrayal was organized, calculated. Meredith was not shielding her store, she was shielding her brother. From the corner of his eye, Harlan caught movement in the dining area. A young girl, no more than 18, clutched a rag as she circled a table. Her hands fumbled over crumbs, her gaze darting away whenever he looked her way. Yet every few seconds her eyes returned to him, wide, uncertain, searching. Fear lived in her expression, fear of saying too much, of breaking whatever silence held this place together. But beneath that tremor, another flicker stirred. A quiet ache to speak to, hand over the truth pressed like stone against her chest. She wiped faster than needed, dropped a spoon, bent quickly to hide the shake in her fingers. Her name tag read Leora. And in her awkward stillness, Harlan recognized a truth sharper than reports the staff knew. They were prisoners of their own silence, each bound by intimidation. And among them, this girl was closest to breaking. Harlan rose steady and walked back toward the counter. He asked for the store's phone number, a casual request, nothing more. When the digits appeared on a scrap of paper, he dialed them on his own device. Across the room, through the frosted glass, a figure stirred as the office phone rang. Meredith Klain lifted the receiver, her silhouette crisp against the blur. "This is Meredith," she said, voice smooth, practiced. Harlan's lips curved without mirth. "This is Harlan West," he answered, each word deliberate. "I'm sitting in your restaurant." Silence followed, heavy enough to slice the air. He could almost hear her inhale, sharp and uneven, though she tried to hold it steady. The trap had been sprung not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with presence. She knew now that her shadow was not invisible. The man she thought absent was already here watching, and he had spoken her name. The office door opened, and Meredith Klain stepped out. Her cardigan was neatly buttoned, her hair arranged with deliberate care, the very picture of composure. Yet her eyes betrayed her tight-guarded, too alert for casual calm. The staff noticed first their movements, faltering silence, folding over the room as though a current had shifted. She approached the booth with the poise of a practiced manager's smile pinned in place, each step calculated to project authority. Harlan did not rise. He gestured toward the empty seat across from him, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said, voice even. She obeyed, lowering herself onto the cushion with a grace that felt rehearsed. The air was heavy, pressing down on both of them. Between them sat the half-eaten slice of apple pie, its crust sagging, its filling exposed. Harlan slid the plate toward her, slow and deliberate. The gesture was simple, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Try it," Harlan said, his eyes fixed on hers. Meredith hesitated, a flicker of resistance tightening her jaw. Then, with a steadiness born of necessity, she picked up the fork and cut a small piece. The bite lingered on her tongue, far too long, each chew an attempt to mask the truth. She swallowed carefully, her face arranged into neutrality. A little sweeter than usual, perhaps she offered the words measured, too cautious. Harlan leaned forward, gaze unrelenting. "No, that is not what this is. Our recipe does not vary. It never has." His tone sliced through her excuse, leaving no room for retreat. Her hands folded tightly in her lap knuckles, paling under pressure. Around them, the restaurant moved in subdued rhythm, yet at this table the air was locked, suffocating. The pie sat between them like evidence in a trial, each bite a witness that could not lie. Harlan reached into his pocket and withdrew the slip. He placed it gently on the table. "Sunrise Imports." The letters stared up like a confession. Meredith's eyes flicked down, then up again, darker now, her silence heavier than denial. Finally she spoke, her voice edged with strain. "Apple prices have climbed nearly 60%. I made the choice to keep margins steady. Without it, we would bleed losses." Harlan's reply came cold and swift. "You did not ask. You did not inform. You deceived." The words cut deeper than any raised tone. She straightened her back, a last effort at defense. But the air in the small room had turned dense, unyielding, saturated with the sour weight of betrayal. Every second her justification frayed further, her authority collapsing beneath the truth laid bare on the table. She had admitted enough. It was no longer oversight. It was calculated disobedience. The phone trembled once more, another message from Drake flashing across the screen. "Sunrise has never been FDA approved. Their blends contain banned additives." Harlan read it twice, each word burning deeper. He lifted his eyes, fixed on Meredith, and spoke without volume, but with the weight of a verdict. "You're not cutting costs. You're poisoning my customers." Her face drained of color, the practiced mask faltering, but defiance clung stubbornly to her tongue. "Everyone is doing it." She snapped, brittle and sharp, her words breaking like glass under pressure. Harlan didn't blink. "No," he said, slow and cold. "We do not." The table between them carried more than pie crust and paper slips. It bore the fracture between principle and greed. What had begun as financial deceit now revealed itself as criminal violation. This was no longer merely betrayal of brand or trust. It was danger slipped quietly onto plates. Harlan reached into his pocket, withdrew a small recorder, and set it gently on the table. The red light blinked to life, a silent witness that needed no bias. "Do you wish to add anything else?" he asked. Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. She chose silence, though silence here was not protection but confession, without words. The air thickened heavy with what had just been captured, the absence of denial, the surrender of truth through refusal. Every second the device ticked on, cataloging her stillness, her guilt, her complicity. Harlan let the pause linger, then stood. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor, marking the end of their first confrontation. He left her sitting beneath the weight of her own decisions, the walls around her shrinking inward. The room behind him collapsed into a void of failure and fear, but his steps carried something sharper. Proof had begun. The following day, Harlan returned to the Scranton store under a different guise. His suit and cap were replaced with a pressed uniform shirt and a laminated tag clipped to his chest, "Mr. Jameson, Internal QA." He carried no aura of authority now, only the quiet efficiency of an inspector lost in routine. The staff met him with stiff courtesy, their greetings rehearsed, voices strained thin. Meredith was absent, but her shadow lingered in the air, a presence threaded through their unease. Every glance avoided his every movement carried tension, as though each worker had been instructed to obey silence more than honesty. The dining room echoed with that fear, a collective restraint that spoke louder than words. Harlan observed, steady noting not just their tasks but the void inside their eyes. The disguise gave him distance, but also access. Beneath the calm mask of inspection, he was laying bait for truth. Harlan requested access to the store's records. A young clerk logged into the system, eager to prove compliance. On the surface, everything gleamed with legitimacy: invoices from Maple Valley Prescott Farms, the two official vendors whose fruit had defined the brand for years. The numbers balanced, shipments matched, margins looked clean. But Harlan had spent decades studying how deceit wears its mask. He navigated deeper into the directory, each click deliberate. Then he saw it, Vendor Alt, a folder tucked quietly beneath layers of routine reports. Inside, the picture changed. Line after line of payments marked to Sunrise Imports, hidden under the label Local Product Initiative. Deliveries, amounts, dates meticulous but false. 2 parallel books, one to pacify headquarters, one to reveal the truth. His eyes traced the evidence, the digital shadow of intent. This was not sloppiness. This was craft. Fraud, dressed as order, masquerading as discipline. The neatness of it only confirmed its guilt. From the office, he moved down into the cold belly of the store. The freezer door opened with a hiss breath rolling outward in pale clouds. Inside, crates lined the walls, stacked high. Some bore the familiar green and gold stamp of Marie Callender's official branded expected. Others were stark white boxes marked only with codes, among them the unmistakable seal of Sunrise. Harlan pulled one open. The bag inside sagged heavy with filling dark and viscous, a sheen too glossy a thickness unnatural. He tore the corner, and the smell struck him, syrupy, sharp, cloying enough to burn the throat. It was the scent of fraud, sweetened to disguise its emptiness. He lifted his phone, documenting crate after crate, angles and labels captured in silence. Each photo became a witness, each frame an accusation. The freezer was not cold enough to bury what he had uncovered. It only made the rot more visible. Evan, the shift lead, accompanied him reluctantly, his movements awkward, hands rubbing together in nervous repetition. When Harlan asked who handled shipments, the answer was immediate. Only Meredith. No one else touches them. The words carried weight, as if rehearsed through fear rather than policy. Evan's eyes dropped to the floor as he added more. Trucks with no markings arrived in the early hours, Tuesdays and Fridays, unannounced and unlogged. Employees were kept away from the kitchen when the deliveries came, ordered to remain out front until Meredith herself locked the crates inside storage. Harlan studied the young man's face. The fear was plain etched into every flicker of his eyes, every pause in his speech. This was not ignorance, it was control, exercised like a leash on the staff. Meredith had built her own wall of silence, and the boy standing before him bore the marks of its weight. Harlan's questions shifted carefully, drawing threads one at a time. "Has anyone ever raised concerns?" before he asked. Evan's chest rose with a sigh heavy enough to weigh the room down. "Carlos," he answered quietly. He used to be assistant manager, said the filling tasted wrong, spoke up once. 2 weeks later his hours were cut to nothing. Then he was gone. The words fell like stone final and heavy, impossible to ignore. Carlos wasn't just a name, he was a marker, a warning carved into silence for everyone else. Speak, and you disappear. Complain, and you're erased. Harlan noted it with a cold precision, his eyes darkening as the shape of the abuse crystallized. This was not carelessness, it was suppression. Meredith had built more than a scheme. She had built a system that devoured dissent. Evan's face tightened, regret flashing and then retreating. Fear had finished what intimidation began. One by one, the staff filed in for their interviews. Harlan asked the same simple questions. Each answer mirrored the last, like voices pressed through the same mold. Everything's fine here. We have no problems. The store runs smoothly. The cadence was too even, the tone too uniform, a recital more than confession. Their eyes betrayed what their mouths concealed, glances slipping sideways, lips pressed too firmly after each line. It was as if Meredith herself stood in the room, her script woven into their throats. Harlan wrote the words anyway, but he heard the silence between them louder than the repetition. The atmosphere thickened, the space itself transformed into a chamber of constraint, more interrogation than conversation. The truth was not absent, it was strangled, rehearsed until only fear remained. Each identical phrase was not reassurance, it was proof. Proof of training, of coercion, of a workplace muted into obedience. Then came Leora. She entered with her backpack still slung over one shoulder, fingers twisting the strap into knots. She perched on the edge of the chair as though it might swallow her whole. When asked about her training, her voice faltered, then steadied with a quiet confession. They had been made to sign papers. Not contracts, not orientation manuals, but confidentiality forms. She had been told the rules clearly, no speaking about ingredients, no mentioning vendors, not even to family. Any word beyond the store would count as betrayal. Harlan's pen paused mid-line. It wasn't policy, it was a gag order, binding fear to ink. The girl's eyes flicked up wide, searching his face as if weighing whether truth was safe here. He saw the weight of the paper pressing against her invisible shackles, dressed as formality. An NDA forged for silence wrapped around her like iron. Her whisper carried injustice. Leora's words came haltingly at first, but once spoken they cut with clean edges. James asked about the filling, she whispered, said it tasted wrong. She paused, her fingers gripping her backpack strap. A few days later he was taken off the line. They made him scrub toilets, every shift. Then his hours disappeared. He stopped coming. The story weighed down the air, heavy and immovable like stone placed on a chest. One man's question had become everyone else's warning. Speak, and you are buried. Resist, and you are erased. Now, no one asks. Leora added, her voice shrinking. Everyone stays quiet. We keep our heads down. Harlan listened, his jaw set, the light in his eyes hardening into steel. Fear had been sharpened into a weapon here, wielded with precision by someone who knew control meant silence. The girl's voice trembled with memory, but his silence was colder still. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a thread. The trucks come Tuesday and Friday. Always the same. White, no logos. Meredith meets them alone. The words bled out like a confession, long withheld. When they arrive, she clears the kitchen. Orders us all out front. No one sees what's brought inside. Only her. Leora swallowed hard, then added, I never told anyone. I thought it wouldn't matter. Her eyes met his, fragile but steady. But now, you know. The statement hung between them, fragile as glass but strong enough to carry the weight of truth. For the first time, hope cracked through the fear. She had placed her trust in him, risking the same fate as James, but unable to hold her silence any longer. Harlan absorbed the words without reaction, but inside he recognized their gravity. The secret was no longer hidden. It was alive, passed into his hands. The proof arrived sooner than expected. Morning light stretched pale across the lot when the unmarked truck pulled in earlier than its usual hour. Harlan watched from inside, clipboard in hand, his disguise intact. Workers stiffened at once, their chatter dying mid-sentence. Meredith strode out with quiet command, her figure tense, her movements rehearsed. A crate rolled down heavy, stamped in black marker LO 3821. The same code he had seen on the tainted sample before. She alone touched it, wheeling it through the back hall, locking the cooler with a practiced hand. The staff stood silent, Eyes lowered their fear a wall thicker than the freezer door. Not one dared ask what had arrived or why. Harlan's grip on the clipboard tightened, his knuckles whitening against the press of wood and paper. There was no longer suspicion, no longer whispers. Fraud had stepped plainly into the open, and he had witnessed it. Harlan closed the distance, each step measured, each breath controlled. Meredith was still by the cooler, her hand brushing invisible dust from her cardigan. "Let me see the invoice," he said, his voice stripped of pretense. She didn't flinch. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes sharp as glass. "That won't be necessary," she answered, the dismissal cutting clean. The refusal was deliberate, not hesitation, but defiance, a challenge etched into her stare. The staff nearby froze, their attention split between fear of her and the quiet authority in him. The silence thickened, suffocating, pressing inward like the walls themselves were shrinking. For weeks he had recorded, noted, gathered. But here, in this single denial, the dam broke. It was no longer silence cloaked in numbers. It was rebellion, stated plainly. The weight of control, of secrecy, of intimidation reached its breaking point. He stood in front of her, unyielding, and the restraint within him finally snapped. In the break room, the tension crystallized. Harlan reached to his chest and unclipped the laminated badge that had given him cover. He laid it aside, then drew another from his pocket, a single card embossed in black and silver. He set it on the table where she could not ignore it. Harlan West, Chief Executive Officer Marie Callender's. Meredith's face drained, her practiced composure crumbling as recognition struck. The air itself seemed to halt, every sound outside muffled into nothing. She had hidden behind reports, behind silence, behind her own authority, but now the veil was ripped away. The man across from her was no inspector, no faceless auditor. He was the very name etched on every menu, every sign above every door. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. He broke it with a whisper, words heavier than any shout. "I am not unfamiliar. I am the owner." Meredith tried to recover her voice, trembling at first, but then hardening into brittle resolve. "Costs have risen. I had no choice but to adapt. If I hadn't made changes, this store would already be dead." Her words cracked with both pride and desperation, a final barricade against the inevitable. Harlan leaned forward, his eyes steady, the steel in his tone, unbending. "You did not adapt. You poisoned. You put profit before people." She lifted her chin, the last glimmer of defiance alive in her gaze. "You don't understand. Without me, this place would have collapsed." Her voice sharpened into accusation, as if to drag him into her ruin. Harlan answered without pause. "No, it isn't dying because of hardship. It's dying because of deceit." The words struck with finality, stripping her excuses bare. The room held only the truth now, one side clawing at justifications, the other dismantling them with certainty. The door opened, and Drake entered with a folder thick enough to bend in his grip. He laid it flat on the table, each page a fracture widening into revelation. 4 more stores spread across the region, all bearing the same quiet signature of fraud. Duplicate invoices, 2 sets of books, Sunrise imports appearing in shadow where the official suppliers vanished. He flipped the documents one by one, and the pattern repeated with surgical precision. This was no isolated rebellion. It was a network branching outward like veins of rot beneath the brand. Meredith sat rigid, the denial in her face thinning as the evidence piled higher. The truth was no longer confined to Scranton. It stretched across cities, a system thriving on secrecy and fear, with her name recurring at its center. The picture was whole now, not a single manager cutting corners, but a hub orchestrating deceit across the map. Her mask cracked, but her defiance still burned. "You think this means you've won?" Meredith's eyes-flashed voice sharpened by desperation. "I only did what you never could. I made it profitable. I made it efficient. Better than you." The words spat out like venom, clinging to the silence after. Harlan did not rise to meet her fury. He sat still, shoulders squared, his tone steady, almost quiet. "Yes," he said, "you made it work. But shortcuts always lead to the edge of a cliff. No flourish, no volume, only weight like stone dropped in water." His words landed with finality, leaving no space for her rage to echo. Meredith's retort withered before it formed, her lips tightening into silence. Authority no longer came from her voice. It hung instead in the calm certainty of his. The power shifted, invisible yet absolute, and she felt the cold edge of judgment pressing in. Within the hour, Drake returned, flanked by corporate counsel and 2 security officers. Their presence filled the doorway with quiet inevitability. Customers were addressed politely, their meals refunded and full vouchers pressed into their hands as they were ushered out. Confusion rippled, but the process was smooth rehearsed. Soon, the dining room emptied, leaving only the staff gathered under the weight of what was unfolding. Harlan stepped into the center of the floor, the silence wrapping around him like a mantle. His voice carried with neither anger nor triumph. "This store is now closed," he said, pending full investigation. The words struck harder than any shout, the final seal of authority pressing down. Gasps flickered among the employees, disbelief shading their faces. Meredith stood at the edge, lips parted but no words willing to rise. The decision was irreversible, the line crossed. What she had built in secrecy was undone in a single declaration. The staff stood clustered, waiting for judgment, as if the floor itself might collapse. Harlan let the silence rest before he spoke. "You are not punished," he said, voice firm but steady. "You will continue to receive pay during this investigation. Only those who conspired will lose their place here." The words sank in slowly like warmth entering a room long kept cold. Shoulders eased, eyes lifted. Leora's gaze in particular brightened her relief, unhidden, fragile, yet undeniable. Fear loosened its grip, replaced by the faint stirrings of trust. Around them, the store no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a place where voices might return. Harlan saw it in the subtle shifts, backs no longer bent, hands, unclenching glances exchanged without dread. Hope flickered in the ruin, delicate but alive. The storm had not destroyed them. It had stripped away what held them captive, leaving room for air again. 2 guards stepped forward and Meredith was led from the room. Her posture was stiff, her chin raised in defiance, but her eyes burned with fury. Each step echoed against the tile, the sound sharp reverberating like the last nails driven into her command. The glass door closed behind her, sealing her exile with final clarity. Not one employee moved to follow, not one glance carried regret. The silence that trailed her was not mourning, but release. Harlan remained still, not offering her a final look. His gaze fell instead on the half-eaten slice of pie resting on the table, its crust sagging, its filling congealed into something lifeless. Cold, abandoned, yet damning. It was more than dessert now, it was evidence, a symbol of betrayal caught in its own lie. As she vanished beyond the glass, he let the image settle in his mind. Justice did not always roar. Sometimes it was quiet, unflinching, merciless. News spread like wildfire through the company's veins. Reports surged across headquarters, then outward into the public. Each store tied to Sunrise Imports fell under audit one by one, the pattern unmasked with precision. What had begun in Scranton revealed itself as a chain-wide infection, its reach wide, its roots deep. Authorities moved quickly. Sunrise Imports shuttered overnight, its warehouses sealed. Silas Klain taken into custody, his name plastered across headlines. Articles called it a reckoning, an upheaval, a storm within Marie Callender's violent but cleansing. The phrase repeated itself in bold print, the Marie Callender's storm. Investors speculated, customers whispered, the industry watched. But Harlan spoke little. While others framed the scandal in numbers and spectacle, his thoughts drifted back to a single slice of apple pie, true and honest, the kind that carried memory instead of fraud. It was not victory he sought, nor revenge. Only the taste of integrity restored. 3 months later, the Scranton store no longer resembled its former shell. Glass that once dulled with fingerprints now shone clear, throwing sunlight across polished floors. The kitchen was no longer hidden. It opened fully to the dining room, stainless counters, gleaming ovens, visible, nothing concealed. Every ingredient carried a red QR code, traceable at a glance, proof not just of supply, but of honesty. Customers stepped in and saw more than food. They saw a promise. At the front, Leora greeted them with a smile that no longer trembled, her voice steady, welcoming. Marcus Tern, dressed in the crisp maroon of management, moved through the line with quiet authority, no longer the hesitant shadow he once was. The store felt alive again, not because of profit charts or promotional screens, but because its soul had returned. Fear had been purged, trust had been planted. The air held warmth, not secrecy. From the oven, a tray of apple pies slid forward, their crusts golden, the steam rising in gentle waves. The scent of cinnamon unfurled into the air, carrying memory, not deceit. Harlan stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching as slices were lifted, carefully plated with care. He let the silence hold a moment, then spoke, his words low-measured and final. "You can fake ingredients. You can fake numbers, but you cannot fake decency. The staff stilled listening as the truth pressed into the room. Then hands came together, a ripple of applause growing steady, not forced, but genuine. It wasn't for him, not entirely. It was for themselves, for what had been rebuilt, for what would endure. The message lingered, woven into the air like the scent of pie itself. The lesson had been carved into them stronger than fear, stronger than fraud. And it would remain. Integrity is the ingredient you can't fake. The sentence falls like stone, leaving silence to carry its weight. A story of pie, of deceit, of reckoning, yet at its core, it is about truth. We all know the feeling something looks right, yet inside we know it is wrong. When that moment comes, what will you choose? If you still believe in decency, let this story live beyond you. Pass it on.